So I was really excited to check out the new docuseries Worst Roommate Ever on Netflix because one of the stories happened right in my hometown, and I remember the case. But aside from that, is the series interesting enough to binge? Worst Roommate Ever highlights four harrowing tales of seemingly harmless roommates turning into real life nightmares for their unsuspecting victims when their malevolent and sometimes violent intentions are revealed. These unsettling true stories chronicle the masked menace that can be lurking right down the hall. There are four stories told in this, but there are 5 episodes, as one just takes a little longer to tell. Now, these stories can be watched in any order as they are just standalone cases and they're not linked at all. The documentary covers the cases of Dorothea Puente, an older lady with quite the secret, Casey Joy, a somewhat clingy roommate who has boundary issues, Youssef Khater, an ultramarathoner with just a lot of stories that he likes to tell, and Jamison Bachman, a serial squatter. So the case that first intrigued me with this series is the one involving Dorothea Puente. Now, she is a landlady who ran a boarding house where I grew up. Now, not to spoil things too much, but I think she watched Arsenic and Old Lace just a few too many times and then got inspired. The documentary does a good job of detailing out the case with news footage and interviews, but there was still one massive looming question that I had that went unanswered. My question had to do with how she was able to transport the things that she did, especially one that involved a box near a river. Now, this lack of info isn't enough to ruin the episode, but I do wish some of that would have been addressed. I mean, even if she had just refused to answer, at least we would have known that they asked the question. The case of Casey Joy is another sad one. And honestly, I mean, these are all very sad and disturbing in their own rights. But the story with Casey Joy revolves around him moving into an apartment with a young military veteran who was going back to school after retiring from the military so that she could get her degree. Joy becomes infatuated, and then bad things happen. This one was particularly interesting because the documentary got a bunch of interviews from police on how they conducted their investigation. That was then coupled with surveillance audio, and it plays out like a mystery show. Now, some of the information would be a little hard to believe, or at least it would seem odd, but because there is so much video footage from the investigation, it puts together a really compelling case and something that's intriguing to watch. As I'm sure that you are seeing the trend here, none of these stories are very happy in the things that go down. I mean, the next case goes outside of the United States and it spans across multiple countries. The story of Youssef Khater feels a little like two very recent documentaries that we just got on Netflix, The Tinder Swindler and The Puppet Master. Now, this story is a little convoluted in the way that the story is told, simply because there are several people who are sharing their account and experiences. Now, the story bounces between them, which in one way makes sense because it's telling the story chronologically, but there are parts of events that are interrupted by other portions of the story, which then make it feel just a little bit disjointed. For example, the main person telling their account describes a night where she was out with Youssef, and the story then feels like it reaches its conclusion, especially because then the documentary shifts focus onto a different person's experience and time with Youssef. But about 10 to 15 minutes later, the story revisits the first account and then continues the story. I mean, it's almost like the middle portion had parentheses around it as kind of an aside. I mean, all the information was important and it's interesting, but the way that it's presented made me stop for a second and try and figure out where we were in the timeline. The final case involves serial squatter Jamison Bachman, and this story spans 2 episodes because of how widespread his exploits were. We get interviews from many of his victims, and even some offshoot interviews from people that knew Jamison as a kid or maybe even as a teenager. This story is very frustrating from a justice standpoint. Now, while they don't get into it in great detail, the tenant eviction laws in many parts of the US are good in one sense because they help protect the rights of renters. But on the other hand, there are areas of the law that can be manipulated and really allow bad people to legally squat in a residence and be untouchable by the law. In this story, there's a scene at the very end of the first episode that has this wonky transition to it. The story goes from describing a horrifically violent scene that happened when Jamison was in college, and then it transitions to describing a scene that is horrifically violent, but more in the present. Now, there is a date that comes up on the screen, but my brain just didn't register that at first because of how the narrative itself was being presented. I mean, it felt like one continuous piece of information, which then led me to believe that a huge piece of the story had been unanswered when the episodes finally ended. I mean, this was so much so that I actually went back to part of the episode to rewatch just to figure out how I'd missed it. Now, maybe you won't have that problem, but from a storytelling perspective, the information just felt too closely related without enough of a transition to identify the different timelines. Now, I'm hit and miss when it comes to reenactments within documentaries. I mean, sometimes they're done really well, and other times it just feels way too overdramatic, and then it breaks me out of the story. In this, I love how they did them. They used hand-drawn animation, and it's typically placed over real photo backgrounds that have then been digitized or maybe even painted to look like they're kind of animated also. And this allows the story to show us sort of what happened without feeling like we're watching a dramatization. And then really, the art, it looked awesome. The episodes are 40 minutes to an hour in length, and they go by pretty quickly. We were able to binge them all in one sitting, and I didn't get bored. I was disgusted at humanity, but I wasn't feeling the time. The cinematography in this is beautiful, and I really love how they frame the interviews. Now, there are some shots of the interviewees where they'll be sitting or standing in a location where the camera slowly pushes in on them. And this, at times, it felt a little melodramatic, especially when it was used on the same person more than once in an episode. So overall, Worst Roommate Ever is an eye-opening documentary on some really terrible people who took advantage of their situations and made life a living hell for those living with them. The interviews look wonderful, and the documentary captures many first-hand accounts, which make the storytelling very engaging and it's captivating. Now, while I would have liked some of the narratives to be a little less convoluted in their execution, the stories themselves are worth checking out. This may also frustrate you or maybe even lessen your hope for humanity, but can also be used as a cautionary tale where we can learn from others' misfortunes. There's no sex or nudity, but there is a lot of profanity and some violent imagery and descriptions of violence. I highly recommend checking out Worst Roommate Ever on Netflix. Do you have any roommate nightmare stories that you want to share in the comments below? I'd love to read them if you want to share. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.